Hey everyone, my name's Aaron. I'm going to be talking about the movie Bullet Train today. I'm going to start off with a general overview so we can better understand the movie and the analysis moving forward. First off, movie takes place in Japan on a bullet train. Main character goes by codename Ladybug and is starred by Brad Pitt. He is an agent filling in on a basic mission to acquire a briefcase with money and gold. He's met with multiple assassins along the way that keep him from getting the case. The case ends up swapping hands a few times and does not end up in his possession at the end. Ultimately, his bad luck keeps him on the train and he is unable to escape it. This forces him into facing a Japanese villain that goes by the name of the White Death. So I'm going to look at a couple things like ideologies and then some representation and stereotypes. Okay, so the first thing I want to look at is ideologies, the big one being individualism. We can kind of see this with the code names presented. Looking at the twins first, they go by Lemon and Tangerine, which are some interesting code names, kind of shows their personality, shows that they're funny. Looking at the main female in the film, she goes by code name The Prince, and a few other code names we see are the Wolf, the Elder, the Hornet. They're all unique. We also see some of this individualism come through in the personalities. Looking at Lemon, he's fascinated with the show Thomas the Tank, and he uses the characters in the show to kind of classify people and pin people's personalities. We also see Prince jumping back and forth between two different personalities, which we'll talk about a little later as well. And then some of the attire that comes through in the show. The Wolf is dressed in traditional Latinx wedding attire. And then we also see Lemon. He's a black male who has white hair. So this kind of shows some more individualism traits. I saw a couple tropes for individualism. The first being this idea of the lone hero, which we see in a lot of films today. We see this with the main character, Ladybug, starred by Brad Pitt, who's after the case. He's the one that's supposed to have it. He takes kind of an unconventional route. He's a very nonviolent person, so this kind of ties back into that individualism. But we also see it with almost all the other characters in the film. They all have their own way of doing things, their own way of acquiring the case, and they all think that they're the lone hero in the story. So we see all these lone heroes clashing, which I thought was really interesting. We also have this trope of the villain being damaged or scarred or wearing a mask to represent that they're different from the rest of the characters. In this film, the villain is the White Death. We see him pictured in a dragon mask to kind of show this individualism that he is who everybody's going against. And this kind of ties back into that idea of individualism, that everybody has their own way of doing things, everybody has their own way of presenting themselves, and that you need to be your own self. Okay, so this next ideology I took a look at was this idea of patriarchy, both for and against it, which I thought was really interesting that both were in the film. So, supporting it, most of the assassins are male, including the White Death, who's an older male that runs Japan. Also, other assassins look down on the main female character, the princess, this innocent girl who's dependent on others and needs help. But against it, at the same time, the prince shows a lot of power, intelligence, and control of the situation. So a good example of this is Lemon and the prince interact, and she plays into this damsel in distress role, faking it, and tries to manipulate Lemon into thinking that she is playing no part in what's occurring on the train. Looking at this damsel in distress trope I mentioned, is really interesting because the prince plays both sides of this. She is the damsel in distress, but she's faking it at the same time. And I just thought this is really interesting that both sides were played in the film. And this kind of ties into some gender stereotypes we see a lot. And looking at the Critical Theory Toolbox by Weinstock 2022 Pop Culture for Beginners, it talks about traditional stereotypes, and it sees women as passive, dependent, and weak, traditionally in our society, and this is exactly how she gets painted in the film. And it all overall just kind of ties into this idea that we are a male-dominated society and that women are inferior. The last ideology I'd like to take a look at is this idea of self-determinism versus fate. The whole driver of the movie is this idea of bad luck, that everything that can go wrong will go wrong for the main character, Ladybug, and that fate is destined to keep him on this train. One example of this is as Ladybug is trying to exit the train with the case, he encounters another assassin, the Wolf. As he tries to leave, they get in an altercation, and this prevents him from leaving the train. Another good example of this is as he's in a fight with another assassin, he gets bit by a poisonous snake that happens to be on the train, and this prevents him from leaving as well. And the last example is he tries to leave the train without the case, abandoning the mission, and another assassin forces him to stay aboard the train. So looking at a trope I found in the determinism versus fate section is the idea that a ladybug represents luck, and in this movie, Ladybug is anything but lucky. And it's even explicitly stated in the show that this is why his codename is Ladybug, because he's unlucky. And I think this just ties back to our semiotics we learned earlier in the semester, where a symbol in society can have a deeper cultural meaning than what it actually is. And looking at an article by Ingold 2000, Anthropology, Humanity, Culture, and Social Life, it says culture is an elaborate system of units that are symbols, and in general, symbolic meanings shared within a society realized during social interaction. So it just kind of reestablishes this idea that this symbol of a ladybug can have a deeper cultural meaning than what it actually is. I think overall this kind of ties into this stereotype of that fate is ingrained in Japanese culture, and that's just how things work. And we can really see that with a character called the Elder, who is an old Asian man pictured as wise, calm, intelligent. He gives out wisdom to others, and particularly Ladybug, and overall just kind of ties back into this idea of, do we have self-determination or fate? Because there's external factors on our lives that we have zero control over. Moving on to representation and stereotypes, the first thing I notice is with this character, the Wolf. He's a Latinx man. His whole backstory is that he's a part of the cartel. He's a violent man looking for revenge for wrongdoings. And this is a very popular stereotype we see in films and TV shows today. Also, another one, as I mentioned earlier, was this idea of the elder, an old Asian man, wise and calm, giving wisdom to younger individuals. And then as we move on to look at the film as a whole, we see this hierarchy stereotype that we see a lot in films when they're set in Japan, where people have to commit crimes to establish themselves, to give themselves a reputation, and ultimately gain status within the community. Another stereotype I saw in the film as a whole is the idea that Japan's environment is very high etiquette, very polite, very quiet, and we can see this come through with things like the train always being on time. It's very punctual when it comes and goes. We also see assassins early on in the film being shushed in the quiet car, reinforcing this idea that it's a very quiet place. Another scene shows a train staff member interacting with two assassins in the midst of conflict and is very polite with them. So I decided to take a look at an article, How Americans and Japanese See Each Other, Stokes 2015, and quote, most Americans don't ascribe negative stereotypes to Japanese. Only 36% of their poll sees them as intolerant and 19% as selfish. And on the other hand, when we look at some positive attributes, 94% of the poll saw them as hardworking. So this reinforces some of these stereotypes that we already have in everyday life. Lastly, just to touch on why all this is important to us and why we need to know it. The media we consume shapes the way we view things, the way we view people, and it subconsciously affects the way we interact with the world. So it's important for us to have the tools to be aware of the messages being conveyed through media, whether that's film, whether that's newspapers, whether that's radio broadcasts. We have the tools now to understand the messages being given to us. This allows us to reflect on the positive things we get from these kinds of sources and to understand the bad things that we get from these kinds of sources, like stereotypes. It allows us to filter this out and choose not to pass that forward when interacting with other individuals.